A couple of people asked, and we went through it in discussion in the online session in Teams yesterday evening, what is a literature review, which is the thing I'm asking you to write. So I took a couple of examples. Many academic articles have a literature review. In the early part of the article, there's the introduction, there's the literature review. What it does is it reviews the existing material that's been written on the topic that's relevant. And it sets up, it builds the foundation of what's been done previously, which then explains why the particular piece of research they're doing advances that. So it's the standing on the shoulders of giants piece, to quote a much used phrase. But what does it look like? And I mean, the thing about it is, and as I said in Teams, many of undergraduate essays in the humanities, in fact, are a literature review, in that you're given a title and a reading list, which is about 20 pages long sometimes, and you can't possibly manage to read all of them, much less process them and get all of the ideas in. But certainly in any, and that's one of the reasons why I'm saying to people that you should really be looking to, in the literature review that I'm asking you to write on a topic, which will then hopefully relate to what you do in the collaborative writing groups. I'm looking for not more than 2 pages. I'm looking for, 3, 4, 5, 6 at most sources, scholarly sources. We're talking about, really shouldn't necessarily have to go above 700 words, possibly less. What I am looking for is that you can produce something that is structured like a literature review, that shows that you understand how one should be put together, and not necessarily that you actually cover everything on the topic, but that you do enough to show that you know what one looks like and how you should go about writing it. And of course, you will eventually submit this as part of your portfolio. So what you'll do now is you'll do it, you'll paste it into the discussion thread, we'll have a look at it, we'll give you some feedback, and of course then for the final version of the portfolio, you can and should, revise it. So you might submit 2 versions, the original and the improved version, and explain why the improved version is better, and that's great, because that's evidence that you've thought about it and that you've learned something. And you get marks for that, from me anyway, all right? So I have a couple of literature reviews. This one I talked about in class, it's from Victoria Goodyear's article about social media apps and wearable technology. So it's an article about doing research and ethical research on teenagers and smartwatches, right? So it's a complex ethical area because any research on living subjects is complicated. Living subjects under the age of 18 is even more complicated, and this goes into territory which has not been, there is no guidelines on it really. And what I've done here is I've taken this out and I've put it in a Google Doc, which I will turn into a PDF for neatness and upload. So this is just the literature review section. And it starts off by saying there's a growing body of literature, right? So there's a paragraph here that talks about literature on digital and internet-based research in a range of disciplines, and she refers to a number of these. And some of these will come up later on under other headings. So it is important here that she has found, for example, that McKee and Porter has relevant stuff to say, but she is not going to have a whole paragraph summarizing what McKee and Porter say. She has organized it by topic. So the bits that are relevant to this initial setup paragraph are here. Other bits will be further down. So this is what it looks like. Each one of these sentences essentially is something that's taken from one of these articles. It may not necessarily be the entire content of the article. It's a summary, in her own words, paraphrased, of what those writers have to say that's relevant to the research project that she's setting up. And then, of course, the paragraph ends. There's a lovely little link here where the last sentence of this paragraph leads into the first sentence of the next one and says basically very little has been written about wearable devices and ethics on research into wearable devices. And then the next paragraph says the gap in understanding. And sure enough, if you look at it in this paragraph, what she's put in again are all the references to people who've written about this gap in understanding about research ethics and wearable devices and the reasons why it's an important problem. And these are actually enumerated first. There's a second there somewhere. There's the second. There's the third. There's the fourth. It's a nice list. And it draws from a whole range of writers. And probably there's a progression, or at least there's a distinction. So these are the points that are made about this topic, all grouped together in one paragraph. This is the proceeding, and in fact, that's the length of that literature review. So it has 2 paragraphs. It's, I think, about 500 words we counted, but it's in a discipline, sports science, where there's not a huge amount of prior literature on the subject she's researching, so there's no point trying to extend the literature review if the material's not there. And what it does is it's sufficient, talks generally about ethics on digital research, and then brings it into the problems of ethics and the gaps on ethics with regard to wearables research. So in 2 paragraphs, she surveys the relevant existing literature and sets up the argument for the next part, which is where she goes on to talk about this particular study and the ethical issues that are involved in it. So that's it. It's about the right length. It's sufficient. Literally 2 paragraphs. Obviously, it refers to a huge range of different readings, all digested down. And there's no way in the one you're doing for me that you'll have that many readings, but that's fine. We're looking for something that looks like this so you understand how it will be put together. Boom, boom, boom. Here's another one. We also looked at individual and team annotation effects on students' reading comprehension. Critical to somatocognitive skills, right? Metacognition is thinking about thinking. So it's when you actually step back and think about how you're studying. So here's the literature review, and if I recall correctly, this is a short one as well, and it starts off by introducing the topic, and then again it has a couple of paragraphs, and this is very almost sad article. It says many library science studies that investigate how students begin a research project have found that some students do in fact begin with library resources. So it talks about the studies, and we recognize some of these. I've used some of these in class from time to time, about how students research stuff. You've read some of these, right? Which is nice. This makes this interesting because what they do here is they reduce some of these to, a single sentence summary. They also, in this single sentence, they talk a little bit about how many people were interviewed. 16 of 21 interviewees, a large survey. Right, is the other one. And then they go along. They have some quotes, 40% of respondents. So this is all from Head. You've read this. A lot of good stuff in there. So Alison Head's paper gets a couple of references, a couple of sentences. Biddix, again, gets a sentence. That's about all there is really in Biddix. I've read it. I've used it a lot. Again, more of the Head and Eisenberg about the Wikipedia study they did. Different article by the same people. They've done a lot of work on this area, right? But that whole paragraph essentially is based on 4 journal articles, and it summarizes the argument of 4 journal articles, which happen to be probably the 4 best journal articles on this issue of how students begin to study. And it's also journal articles that we use, and many of you have read. So it may be interesting to see how this is summarized. And in fact, you could probably get from your discussion posts, particularly about Head and Eisenberg very early on in the first weeks of term, with a bit of editing from there to this. Many of the points that you picked out in the discussion thread are summarized into this. So this is obviously a piece of writing by an academic who's been writing for many years. So of course they're going to synthesize it slightly better than you did, but you can see the progression there, okay? So the next paragraph, there's only 2 paragraphs in this. Well, there's 3, I think, but there's only 2 ideas. When seeking help on their research projects, this is the other idea, students turn to their professors and peers and only sometimes to librarians. Nearly every published study has reached this conclusion. So they then have a sample. It's probably just a sample. There are a lot more research projects that cover this area. So all they've done is they've picked a couple. Bezier and Medal, Pellegrino, um, and basically drawn out quotations and paraphrases from them that support this argument. I suspect there's a lot more. Miller and Murillo continues the same argument. Students consult peers teaching faculty members. And again, Head and Eisenberg, which we know, again, students did not take advantage of reference services. Robinson and Reed, and so on. So they go on and talk about this. And basically, this whole literature review is bad news for librarians. Students don't talk to librarians. Talk to your librarians, okay? Make use of the library modules that are out there on studying and research. They could probably make the point in this part of the literature review without referencing as many articles, because they have said nearly every published study. So they just need a few examples, right? And that's all it is. They found something that's common. They pick some examples that prove that point. So again, there it is. It's a literature review essentially in two substantive parts, both of which actually say the same thing. Students don't talk to librarians. Really, they're nice people. Go and talk to them. Online if you have to, because you can't physically do it so much. So this is collaborative note-taking in flipped learning context. This is a slightly longer literature review, okay? But it's slightly longer because this guy takes a longer build-up, right? Note-taking during lectures in a traditional classroom setting is an integral, prevalent part of education. Yes, we know that, and has been since Greek times. So he's really going back to the beginning of dark ages of time. I don't know how much notes the Greeks took, actually, because they did a whole discourse thing. And then he talks about, so he's talking about pen and paper notes and readings that have explored how students and why students take notes at all, right? So he's taking a long run at it, but he's got a paragraph there that really goes deep into, you know, the early days of discussions about note taking, at least in modern pedagogy, right? And then he brings in a paragraph on cognitive load, which is how much your mind can process, and talks about how the process of note taking is a cognitive challenge. Taking good notes is hard, right? And so he's got a number of studies here which all relate back to the actual how hard it is to take good notes. Cognitive load theory being the fancy term that applies here. So having set up that note-taking has been going on for a long time and it's hard, he then switches to talk about collaborative note-taking. And he says the taking and utilizing of notes is not necessarily a lone pursuit by one learner. Shock horror. And he has, now this is very short. He talks again, he's going back to the 1980s. And collaborative note-taking early on. Although he brings it back up to like pair note taking in 2016. But again, he has a tendency to dig deep in the past, right? And then he gets to, we're getting to the present day, wireless internet and portable electronic devices has encouraged the use of laptops and other devices for note taking. So he talks about, he does get to collaboration here, but mostly he's talking about the advantages of electronic note taking. So he's really getting all the different strands leading in here. And then he talks about debates on social media, about collaborative note-taking, the sharing of one's notes to the entire class, and it has its detractors and supporters. So, in this paragraph, I'm expecting to find both sides of this. The benefits can facilitate better note-taking. Yes, that comes from Kirwa. He actually only has one reference. So he's actually cheated here. Well, he hasn't cheated. He's done something wrong. He's offered us in the start of the paragraph the promise that that there are detractors and supporters of this point of view. But he's not really outlined both of these together. He has one reference to detractors, but he's not really, this is not a great paragraph. However, then he gets to the meat of what he's aiming for, which is note-taking asynchronous online learning environments where students can access course videos at their convenience. And in fact, he's talked about stuff here. Talking about the advantages of recorded lectures. And we saw today in the Digital Education Advisory Group, the Student Union Education Officer presented the results of that survey, which I hope many of you did. And these were the precise things that people said were great about recorded lectures, that they could pause, rewind, skip over. So he then looks at the people who've looked at this in terms of how it's improved note-taking. Some of these I know, Derek Brough, yes, George Velizanos, I recognize some of these studies. In which recordings of live lectures were provided to students as a supplement, and students report better concentration because they could do notes later. So he's got a bunch of studies here, some of them going back quite farther than you would expect. He's talking here about taking notes during recorded lectures. The practice of recording lectures goes back, as far as, he's got some stuff here as far back as 2009, which for some of you is prehistoric, I know, but yeah, the internet didn't exist back then. And people took notes using digital devices and shared them. So he's got the list of these things here, and then he's got the final paragraph is about the shortage of integrated note-taking features in platforms, in learning management systems. So he points to some of the developments where there are some tools that you can use to take notes during a recorded lecture and add them to the lecture and synchronize them with the lecture. And then he goes on, so he then talks about online using a shared note-taking tool, which is a recent enough thing, but I know people have done it in UCC. And essentially people use Google Docs. And lots of people glom in and write the notes together. And then what he does is, having taken this really big long run, and this is a long literature review, it is almost ponderous. And of course I recognize ponderous because I have expertise in being ponderous and pompous. But he then goes on to talk about, to actually study the effects of collaborative note-taking in flipped learning contexts, which is a specific context, and does a study on how that works out. So what he's done in the literature review is he's set up all the prior stuff. This is the stuff that's been done already, which he regards as relevant, or at least it's enough of it, so that someone who picks up his article and has never read about this will get an idea of what's been done already and where all this comes from and what the intellectual genealogy or the intellectual ancestry of this study is. And that's really what a literature review does. And then you go on to do the methods and the study and how it works out. So again, cannot repeat often enough what I'm looking for you to do. This is long-ish. Most of the things you do will be shorter and will have fewer sources that you'll be able to use, but that's fine. I'm not looking for the most encyclopedic literature review ever. I'm looking for evidence that you understand how to construct one. Okay? And hopefully these three will give you some idea what they look like. Funnily enough, there are also articles that are inspiring for other reasons. They may get you thinking about strange and subversive things you can do, like collaborative note-taking. Off you go, so hopefully that will shed a little bit more light. I have no idea how long this video is. Too long, probably, but that will be of help, I hope, in the task that you're doing. I'm just going to minimize this because, and I'm going to shut that over there because, in fact, what I'll do is I'll shut this all the way down here so that you can actually see the beach picture. It seems to me that we're into November and this is a good time to see my beach picture on my desktop of the little town in Spain with this boardwalk along which runs like for about 10 kilometers along the beach. Wish I was there. But there you go. One of my life's ambitions is to have decent Wi-Fi down there so I can teach from the beach. But for the moment, here we are. This is what we do. Stay warm, stay dry. keep organized, keep focused, and hit me with emails either directly or indirectly through the class rep if you have problems.